Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born in 1926 in Biran, Cuba, the illegitimate son of a wealthy Spanish immigrant landowner and his maid. Even as a boy, Fidel showed signs of stubborn defiance and a thirst for knowledge. He studied at Jesuit schools, excelling in sports and debate, before enrolling at the University of Havana to study law. It was there that his radical politics began to take shape. Cuba, then under the corrupt rule of President Fulgencio Batista, was a playground for American mobsters and corporations, while ordinary Cubans lived in poverty and oppression. In 1952, Batista staged a military coup and seized power, canceling elections that Castro had hoped to run in as a young reformist candidate. Outraged, Fidel gathered a small group of rebels, including his brother Raúl, and plotted an audacious attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba in 1953. The attack failed disastrously. Many were killed or captured, and Fidel was arrested. During his trial, he delivered his now famous speech, "History will absolve me," turning himself into a symbol of resistance. He was sentenced to prison but released 2 years later under an amnesty deal. Exiled to Mexico, Fidel regrouped. There he met an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, whose belief in armed revolution matched Fidel's own. Together they trained a small band of guerrillas, and in 1956 sailed back to Cuba on a rickety yacht called Granma. The landing was another disaster, ambushed by Batista's forces. Only a dozen men survived. They fled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they began a long, grueling guerrilla campaign. With local support, cunning propaganda, and Batista's growing brutality, the rebel army slowly gathered strength. By 1959, Batista's regime crumbled. Fidel and his bearded rebels triumphantly marched into Havana, cheered by thousands. The young revolutionary was now the Prime Minister of Cuba. He promised to end corruption, redistribute land, and uplift the poor. But what began as a nationalist revolution soon shifted leftward. Castro nationalized American-owned businesses and aligned with the Soviet Union, infuriating the United States. In 1961, President Kennedy backed a failed invasion by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs, a fiasco that only strengthened Fidel's grip on power and his distrust of the U.S. The following year, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets secretly placed nuclear missiles on the island. After tense negotiations, the missiles were removed, but Castro felt betrayed by his Soviet allies for leaving him out of the final deal. Despite this, Cuba remained firmly in the Soviet orbit. Under Fidel's rule, literacy rates soared, healthcare became free and universal, and Cuba sent doctors and soldiers abroad in acts of socialist solidarity. But freedom of speech vanished. Political opponents were jailed or fled into exile. Dissidents were silenced, newspapers were censored, and surveillance was constant. To many Cubans, Fidel was a hero who stood up to imperialism. To others, he was a tyrant who crushed dissent and plunged the island into decades of economic hardship. In 1980, the Mariel boat lift saw 125,000 Cubans flee to the U.S., many desperate to escape poverty and repression. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost its main benefactor. The island plunged into the special period, a time of severe shortages, blackouts, and hunger. Yet Castro clung to power, outlasting Cold War rivals and countless CIA assassination plots. As he aged, Fidel's once fiery speeches grew more rambling, but no less defiant. He outlived presidents and popes alike. In 2006, an illness forced him to step aside, ceding power to his brother Raúl. Fidel's death, a decade later, in 2016, marked the end of an era. To this day, Fidel Castro remains a towering, divisive figure. To some, he is the last great revolutionary, the David who defied Goliath and gave the poor a voice. To others, he is a dictator who traded one form of tyranny for another. But one thing is certain. For over half a century, Fidel Castro's shadow loomed large over Cuba and the world, shaping the island's fate with every word, every gunshot, and every unbending decision he made.